Hi students, just like in the value study, I wanted to show you how to start your monochromatic. Now, this monochromatic, I had issues with the printer. And mostly it's because it's yellow. It's a yellow subject. So yellow is already the lightest gray there is. So for me to try to print this in color was pretty disastrous. I got this, which is, well, it's disastrous and it's gorgeous. So instead of yellow, now I'm leaning yellow-orange. And especially since yellow-orange was the warm-up that I did, this is going to be what I'm going for. Remember, in your picture, you choose where the white is. You can change it up as long as you use that full scheme that we just did. And in this case, there's so much white already that I can capitalize on that and use that, because a third to a quarter or more of the picture should be white and not the background. I mean, some of the background maybe, but the whole idea with watercolor to make it successful is to push the white forward as positive space. It's a switch that makes it really cool. Now in here I could use black added just like in the warm-up so that I would get these darker values. Obviously I'll never use black. So I printed it black and white just to see if there were any places that I could go deeper into value. And maybe there's some, but it's so subtle that by studying my choice and studying my monochromatic system, it tells me that I'm going to be dealing mostly with high key hue and also pure hue. So I also want to think about where am I going to use wet and wet blending, where am I going to use glazing, hard edges, and maybe later some flare out, some drama, some drip down. There's lift out. I mean, there's so many techniques that I can engage with this. So when you pick your picture, you're also thinking about, how am I going to show depth? How am I going to show highlights and values and saturation, temperature, so much. Now this is a warm temperature hue. I'm going to go with yellow-orange, even though I tried to print it in yellow, but it just didn't work. So just as a demo. And of course, you want this to be 8 by 10 so that you can transfer to 16 by 20. So it may be, you know, change slightly. Just make sure it translates to your surface. So this first printout is actually a great motivator for me because it shows, it used up a bunch of ink on my printer, but it's like it already has volume and value, even though it's just this yellow-orange hue. I mean, I could paint the whole thing like this and not feel like I missed anything, but I want to use the full range. I want to use the full range of value and volume. So, as you know, same thing. You pick your composition, you gesturally draw it, or if you want to use the grid, whatever, and you lightly, after you get everything messy, transfer it with the yellow carbon, and then you alone can barely see what it is. And I press harder just because I want you to be able to see what it is that I'm doing. But the point of watercolor is you barely should see it. It's for you to see the composition you spent so much time drawing, not what other people see. I'm just going to start painting. What's called an underpainting. An underpainting is the first wash. In a way, this is an underpainting. It's a way to block in shapes without decimating the white. It's very strategic, step by step, like anything else with watercolor. You have to really think it through in advance, because if it messes up, you got to start over, and that's fine. But at some point, you want to really be ready to go, so it's the final version. So I'm going to use this as a reference, just to block in my even washes, because even wash is a technique. So I'm just going to set this here, and I'm going to use a flat brush, at least on the base of it, to start. You may have a small image that you're working from, and that's fine. In fact, I'm going to work from this only because the black and white version of it is so much more visible. If you're using blue or red violet or something, it's a little more visible, but I'm just going to start blocking in these values. And so you always want to start big to small. The biggest flat brush first for the shape, for the area. 2-inch a lot of the times to start with. And set this here. I'm just going to start blocking in my big old shapes. And as yellow-orange, I'm able to do that without being too committal because it's so light in value. Move this up. And just like cross contour, you want to move in the direction that it moves. Sometimes in the pictures you chose, they're so brilliant and bold that there's no way for us to duplicate those. Even if you were to buy those sort of colors and put them in your palette, it's still hard to duplicate. What's a little weird, and some of you may have noticed, is if you're painting food, and this is food, this is like a Jell-O lemon bar thing or whatever, you would think it would be like compositionally in line with perspective, but because this is a weird Jell-O shape, they don't anticipate that this is going to flare out. So really what I'm dealing with in this is isometric projection, which is a little frustrating for me, knowing that things flare together, but this one flares out. And it's simply because of the way that the Jell-O cut was cut. So, all right, so I'm gonna have to have some awareness that this is not fully in line with traditional linear perspective, and that might make it look a little weird. Sometimes in a painting we adjust the verticality and the linear elements just to make it look like it wasn't us that made a mistake, but it was the photograph. But in this case, there's just so much cool stuff going on. I'm really not that concerned about it. So, let's see what I'm doing here. It's hard, you know, the thing that's the hardest of watercolor out of everything is that seeing things is really not the goal from the get-go. The goal is for you to see where these things are, not where the rest of us should look to where it is. And so that's what the yellow carbon can be so frustrating, because you can barely see. But in the barely seeing, you have the advantage of coming back later and realizing that your subject doesn't really have hard lines around it. This is a very subtle edge. And if you see a bunch of hard lines, it's not very attractive in a watercolor. So it makes it a little challenging because, I think most people want to see hard lines to define, to control, to know where it is. And when you're using that yellow carbon, you're forced to really rely on you instead of this edge that has to be. I'm adding a little bit of black here which makes it that sort of olive green. And that's intuitive. Like, if you think about it, do it. It's not like there's rules other than the composition, the placement, setting it up, deciding at some point what techniques you want to use. And I'm actually already using techniques. If you've noticed, I'm using even wash. I'm using a little stair step of starting to add black to it a little bit. Setting up the composition. Reiterating my drawing, because a lot of times the drawing changes. I'm already noticing that here, that my drawing could still use a little more study. I'm making a couple lines with the edge of a flat brush, but not a lot. You can see right here what I'm doing. I'm blocking in this shape, that shape, that shape, and that shape, just to get started. It's what they call an underpainting. This is a very diluted step where you're rendering, but you're not committing to anything. And I'm shifting up the saturation and value. It's always great to start with a flat brush. And if you go pale enough, you can build upon this, just like I did in the value study, but now with a little bit of color. In my case, yellow-orange. See, this is kind of going like this. So this is the first step. This is what you want to do when you first address your subject. It's not going to be exact right off the bat, but it's an underpainting. This is what I want you to post, is this underpainting that shows how things move, the direction. And even if you lose sight of your original drawing, it's okay, because you're observing. I'm observing here. I'm observing here the movement. And obviously at some point I'm gonna have to make a reprint of this, or else it's not gonna make sense. But like right here, see right in here, I can decide to make a little wet and wet blending to show some value and volume. You know, and maybe I'm not completely confident yet in how things fall, but I'm able to start plunking in some value, some compositional space. You know, like in this picture, I see a little bit of a edge right here, and I can go in with some black. All you have is paper black and your hue. So I want to save my yellow-orange for the bold, bright moments. You know, maybe I'll do a little dry brush right here. Maybe I'll save it for later, but maybe the dry brush is a tactical move right here. You know, but of course I don't want to lose this edge because it's light, so I'm going to leave it. I can always come back and treat it a little bit, but it's light. I mean, it's not as light as one of these, but it's light enough that I could leave it for a bit and start building a little dry brush. So that is really the first step. That is the key, is to start building these shapes of value regardless of what hue you have. The image is just to inspire the composition with the hue you choose.